The granite maw was a 500-ton slab of pressure-forged obsidianite, a trap so ancient and elegant no energy scanner could detect it. When assassins sealed Princess Lyra of the Valleys conquered inside the temple vault, they didn't bother with plasma charges or toxin vents. They simply walked away, confident the low-gravity princess would die of thirst long before anyone could physically lift a barrier their power armor teams couldn't budge. They didn't account for Marcus Cole, a human cultural attaché with bones 5 times denser than baseline, a nervous system rewired to ignore pain, and hands that once hauled cryocasks bare in Earth's heavy shipyards. 8 centuries. 0 survivors. The granite maw's record was perfect, until Marcus Cole dug his fingers into its micro-ridges and pulled. What happened inside that vault didn't just save a princess. It cracked open the galaxy's understanding of a species dismissed as soft intellectuals who exported grain and poetry. The question now wasn't how a human lifted 500 tons. It was why the conquered's enemies should be terrified. To answer that, we have to rewind to the diplomatic mission that placed a princess and her quiet bodyguard in front of a death trap that had never failed. The Valleys conquered had spent 2 centuries bleeding territory to the Demac dynasty, a regime whose architecture was indistinguishable from its weaponry. Every fortress, every temple, every monument had been built not for beauty but for silent, unassailable murder. The granite maw was the dynasty's masterpiece, a seamless block of pressure-forged obsidianite that had been dropped into its frame 800 years earlier, crushing a rival emperor and 37 of his courtiers in a single, lesson-teaching instant. Since then, no one who had been sealed behind it had ever drawn another breath. The peace summit was supposed to change that. Princess Lyra of the Valleys conquered had gambled her entire political future on a treaty that would end the border skirmishes and open trade corridors through the Demac outer rim. She was the conquered's most brilliant diplomatic mind, a heavy worlder by genetics but a low-gravity vessel by upbringing, her bones hollowed by a life aboard orbital stations, her frame elegant and fragile in a way that made Demac hardliners sneer. She walked into the Temple of Eternal Accord with a slate of concessions, and a bodyguard who drew more mockery than respect. Marcus Cole's official file listed him as a cultural attaché, a title the Demac delegation had laughed about openly. Earth had contributed grain shipments, folk music, and a startling amount of poetry to the galactic community, but it had never produced a soldier anyone feared. Humans were the quiet librarians of the Orion Arm, tolerated because they were harmless. Marcus, with his unremarkable suit and his slow, unthreatening gait, looked the part perfectly. But the assassination plot had been in motion for weeks. A faction within the Demac High Council had no intention of allowing peace. The treaty would dismantle their military supply lines and expose decades of embezzled war funding. Princess Lyra was the keystone. Remove her, and the conquered would fracture. The assassins chose the granite maw because it was poetic, it was ancient. And most importantly, it was undetectable. No energy signature, no digital trigger, just a counterweight mechanism calibrated 8 centuries ago, waiting for a single release lever to be pulled in a temple chamber no outsider even knew existed. The tour was a diplomatic formality. The Temple of Eternal Accord was the Demac's most sacred site, a labyrinth of obsidian corridors and vaulted halls where the air carried the mineral tang of the stone that had crushed their enemies. Lyra moved through it with practiced grace, asking the expected questions, nodding at the expected answers. Marcus stayed 3 paces behind her, cataloging exit routes the way he had cataloged danger in Earth's heavy shipyards. He noticed the temple guards thinning out before anyone else did. He noticed the heavy vibration in the floor, a thrum so low it registered in his reinforced sternum rather than his ears. Lyra was standing in the center of the vault chamber when the mechanism activated. The sound was not an explosion. It was a deep geological groan that seemed to come from the planet itself. The ceiling didn't collapse. A single slab, 500 tons of obsidianite polished to a mirror finish, descended in a controlled, terrifying glide, slotting into the doorway frame with a precision that spoke of ancient engineering genius. The guards were already gone. The corridors were empty. By the time Marcus reached the slab, his palm flat against its cold surface, the assassins were boarding a transport in the temple hangar, congratulating themselves on a bloodless, foolproof execution. The vault's interior lights flickered, then died entirely. Emergency luminescence painted the space in a faint blue glow. Lyra's breath was the only sound for a long moment, already shallower than it should have been. The granite maw had sealed, and the galaxy's most lethal trap had just claimed its 801st victim. The vault's silence was absolute. Lyra slumped against the cold obsidianite wall, her lungs already straining in the thin, recycled air. She had maybe 6 hours before hypoxia dulled her mind, and 2 days at most before her hollow bones and low-gravity physiology surrendered entirely. She had been trained for diplomatic standoffs, not for entombment. Her voice, when it came, was steady but carried the tremor of someone who had already begun calculating her remaining breaths. Marcus did not answer her. He was running his palms across the slab, reading the surface the way a mechanic reads a seized engine. The microridges were nearly invisible, polished smooth by centuries of condescending DMAC architects who had never imagined anyone would be strong enough, or desperate enough, to attempt what he was now considering. He pressed his ear to the stone. There was no vibration, no hidden mechanism, no digital flaw to exploit, just mass. Immovable, unyielding, unforgiving mass. What Lyra didn't know, what no one in the Concord knew, was that Marcus Cole had been built for exactly this. The official file that identified him as a cultural attaché was a diplomatic fiction layered over a classified military failure. Project Atlas had been Earth's unsanctioned attempt to engineer a soldier who could survive the crushing gravity wells of neutron star mining colonies. The augmentation had succeeded in ways the researchers hadn't anticipated and failed in ways that got the program shut down within a decade. Marcus's skeletal density was 5 times baseline human, his tendons woven with synthetic polymers that could withstand tensile loads that would snap a normal femur. His central nervous system had been rewired so thoroughly that pain registered not as a warning, but as information to be cataloged and ignored. But the augmentation had cost him. The project was abandoned. The soldiers it produced were quietly discharged with falsified records and a pension that didn't cover the bone-deep aches of a body too heavy for its own frame. Marcus had taken the cultural attaché posting because it was the farthest from Earth he could get, a place where no one would ask questions about why a man who looked so unremarkable moved with the deliberate care of someone carrying an invisible weight. Inside the vault, he stopped pretending. He shrugged off his diplomatic coat, rolled the sleeves of his shirt past elbows corded with dense, functional muscle. Lyra watched, not understanding. He positioned himself at the base of the slab, his fingers finding the microridges that ran along the lower edge of the frame, grooves meant for nothing more than aesthetic continuity, no wider than a credit chip. He dug his fingertips in until his nail beds whitened, then bled. The first pull was a test. The slab did not move. The second pull was a commitment. Marcus engaged his entire kinetic chain, from the arches of his feet to the locked trapezius muscles in his shoulders, and the vault filled with a sound that had never been heard inside those walls. A subsonic groan, the scream of protesting physics. The obsidianite scraped against its seamless housing, and a thin line of daylight appeared at the top of the frame, barely a finger's width, but it was daylight. Lyra gasped, scrambling to her feet, her diplomatic composure shattered by the impossible sight of a single human deadlifting a barrier that power armor teams of 8 had struggled to manipulate in controlled hangar simulations. The slab rose incrementally, each inch paid for with sweat that dripped from Marcus's jaw and blood that streaked down his forearms from his torn nail beds. His pulse hammered at a rate that would have induced cardiac arrest in an unaugmented man, but his rewired nervous system simply logged the stress and distributed it. The temperature inside the vault climbed as his metabolism converted stored energy into mechanical force. Lyra, finally snapping out of her shock, crouched low, ready to slip through the gap the moment it became survivable. When the opening reached 12 inches, she rolled through, the rough stone scraping her back. She turned, expecting Marcus to release the slab and follow. He didn't. He stood there, arms trembling, holding 500 tons of rock that wanted nothing more than to reclaim its place. His eyes were calm, almost clinical as he calculated the drop speed, his own clearance, the angle of the frame. Then he exhaled, let go, and dove forward in a single fluid motion that cleared the gap half a second before the granite, moss slammed back into its housing with a concussive impact that shook the temple's foundations. Marcus lay on the corridor floor, chest heaving, hands raw. Lyra knelt beside him, her mind still struggling to process what she had witnessed. He didn't give her time. He pushed himself upright, inspected the blood on his hands as if it belonged to someone else, and said 3 words that redefined the stakes entirely. "They're coming back." He was right. The assassins had not simply walked away. They had retreated to a staging area to confirm the kill via remote atmospheric sensors inside the vault. Those sensors had detected the pressure change, the temperature spike, and most damningly, the sudden void where a princess's carbon dioxide output should have been steadily rising. The granite maw had been opened, and now a team of DMEC enforcers was already inbound, armed with weapons far more direct than ancient stone. Marcus didn't know the temple layout, but he understood predators. He found a service corridor, pulled Lyra into it, and began moving with the silent, efficient gait of someone who had survived a childhood in shipyards where heavy cargo could crush a man without warning. The princess, to her credit, did not argue. She kept pace, her hollow bones light enough to follow him through maintenance shafts that DMEC architects had designed for drones. The corridor opened onto a supply hangar half a kilometer from the vault. Parked on the landing pad was the sole surviving transport of the conquered diplomatic mission, a light skiff the DMEC guards had neglected to disable, likely because they had never imagined anyone would live to reach it. Marcus boosted Lyra into the cockpit, climbed in himself, and powered up the engines with a sequence of manual overrides that bypassed the temple's external lockdown. The skiff lifted off as the first plasma bolts from the arriving enforcer squad scorched the pad beneath them. The assassins' fatal mistake wasn't overlooking Marcus. It was assuming that the granite maw was the end of the threat. They had counted on a silent, unbreakable trap and a dead princess. Instead, they got a human bodyguard who had just redefined the known limits of organic strength, and a princess who was now broadcasting a distress call to the conquered fleet, her voice carrying a fury that promised the galaxy's predators were about to become prey. The DMAC dynasty had just opened a door it could not close. The skiff breached the temple's atmospheric envelope with a shriek of overstrained repulsor coils, its hull still radiating the heat of near-impact plasma fire. Lyra gripped the co-pilot's console, her diplomatic training screaming to process the situation through protocol and precedent. There was no precedent for this. The granite maw had been opened by a lone human using nothing but organic force. The assassins were now actively pursuing a secondary termination protocol, and the distress call she had just broadcast on an open conquered frequency was being jammed by a DMEC military signal that should not have been positioned this deep inside neutral territory. Marcus's hands were steady on the manual controls, his bleeding fingertips leaving faint smears on the throttle. He pushed the skiff into a low orbital trajectory, weaving through the temple's defense satellite grid with the reflexive economy of someone who had spent years dodging automated cargo haulers in Earth's chaotic shipyards. The evasion sequence bought them maybe 90 seconds. It was enough time for Lyra's console to light up with a secondary alert that made her blood run cold. The conquered embassy on DMAC Prime had gone dark. All diplomatic channels were severed. And a fleet of DMAC dreadnoughts, identification codes matched to the hardline military faction that had opposed the peace summit from the start, had just crossed the border. The assassination wasn't a rogue action. It was the opening move of a planned invasion. The plan had been elegant in its brutality. Kill Lyra inside the granite maw, a weapon so ancient it would read as a tragic structural failure. Let the Concord's already fractured leadership descend into succession chaos. And under cover of that political paralysis, sweep the border and seize the mining colonies that supplied 60% of the Concord's energy infrastructure. The Dimac dynasty hadn't been negotiating peace. They had been buying time to reposition their fleets, but the plan was already unraveling. Lyra was alive, and her survival had triggered a cascade of failures in the Dimac timetable. The military faction's leader, High Chancellor Drevek, had been the architect. He had personally authorized the Granite Maw Protocol, confident that 8 centuries of unbroken lethality would hold. The news that the trap had failed, that a human attaché had physically lifted the slab, reached his command cruiser 37 minutes later. Drevek's response was not anger. It was cold, clinical adaptation. He ordered the jamming field extended, the conquered embassy liquidated before survivors could transmit, and the dreadnoughts accelerated to maximum burn. The window for a clean decapitation strike had closed. He was now committed to a full war. And then his intelligence officers brought him something worse. The human who had breached the Granite Maw was not an unknown factor. Marcus Cole's biometric signature, captured by Temple scanner logs during the initial diplomatic entry, matched a classified genetic profile lifted from Earth's black archives years earlier. Project Atlas. The failed super-soldier experiment that produced exactly 12 viable subjects before being terminated. 11 of those subjects had been systematically hunted down and dissected by DMEC bioweapons researchers desperate to replicate the augmentation without the catastrophic side effects. Marcus Cole was the 12th. They had believed him dead. He was instead standing on the flight deck of a stolen skiff, bleeding from his nail beds, and completely unaware that he was now the most valuable military asset in the sector. Drevek issued a new order. The princess was still a target, but secondary. The human was to be captured alive. His physiology represented a breakthrough that could tip the balance of a war the DMAC had only anticipated winning through overwhelming numbers. A soldier who could ignore pain thresholds, withstand crushing gravitational forces, and exert strength ratios that shattered biophysical models, if cloned, if weaponized, would render conquered power armor obsolete. The chase that followed was no longer about silencing a witness. It was about acquiring the key to a new kind of warfare. Marcus felt the shift before he understood it. The pursuing fighters broke off their attack runs. The jamming field didn't lift, but it changed frequency, cycling through patterns designed to isolate the skiff rather than destroy it. He had spent his entire post-Atlas life being hunted by the quiet, bureaucratic machinery of governments that wanted their failed experiments erased. The sensation of being a target was not new. The sensation of being a prize was. He banked the skiff into the debris field of the temple's outer ring, threading through the wreckage of centuries-old orbital platforms. Lyra, meanwhile, had pulled up the embassy's final encrypted logs before the signal went dead. Her diplomatic credentials granted her access to the emergency intelligence cache, and what she found there recontextualized everything. The Granite Maw was not merely an execution device. It was the seal on the DMAC dynasty's most heavily guarded secret. A biological archive stored in a pressurized chamber beneath the vault floor, containing the preserved genetic material of the dynasty's founder and the original weaponized pathogens that had conquered half the sector before the Concord's formation. The assassins had sealed Lyra inside that vault not just to kill her, but because she was touring the temple on a day when the archive's automated maintenance cycle left the subchamber temporarily accessible. They assumed she might glimpse something she shouldn't. They were right. When the Granite Maw closed, it triggered a containment protocol that would incinerate the archive in 12 hours to prevent contamination. Drevek's faction had chosen that day for the assassination specifically because the incineration would destroy any forensic evidence of what the vault truly held. The death of the princess was a bonus. The destruction of the dynasty's bioweapons history was the point. Lyra transmitted the data to Marcus's console. He read it in silence, then recalculated their trajectory. They couldn't run. If that archive burned, the conquered would never be able to prove the DMAC's treaty violations, and the invasion would proceed without the diplomatic cover needed to rally neutral systems. The evidence that could expose the conspiracy, the original pathogen samples, the dated research logs, the signatures of the council members who had authorized the program, was located exactly where they had just escaped. The granite maw had to be opened again. And this time, they were flying toward a temple crawling with an enemy that had just upped the stakes from assassination to full-scale war. The skiff punched back through the temple's atmospheric shield, dropping like a stone through the same defensive grid they had escaped minutes earlier. Marcus didn't bother with evasion this time. He flew directly at the landing platform where Drevek's command shuttle now sat, its hull bristling with sensor arrays calibrated to detect biological anomalies. The DMAC enforcers on the ground saw the skiff coming and opened fire, but they weren't aiming for the cockpit. They were aiming to disable the engines. They wanted him alive. Lyra transmitted the archive access codes to Marcus's wrist console. The subchamber beneath the granite maw had a secondary maintenance entrance, a coolant shaft that fed the geothermal vents under the temple's foundation. It was too narrow for a DMAC in combat armor. It was not too narrow for a human with dense bones and a pain threshold that had been surgically rewritten. Marcus brought the skiff down hard on the temple's outer ring, a controlled crash that sheared off the port stabilizer but placed them 20 meters from the vent. He pulled Lyra from the wreckage, his raw hands now wrapped in strips of torn upholstery from the pilot's seat. The two of them moved through the temple's service corridors with the desperate synchrony of people who had stopped counting the odds. Lyra's diplomatic knowledge of the temple layout, the tour, the architectural briefings, guided them past security checkpoints that had not yet been reinforced. Marcus's strength handled the rest. A locked maintenance hatch groaned open under his grip. A collapsed corridor from earlier weapons fire yielded to shoulders that had just deadlifted a 500-ton slab. The subchamber was exactly where Lyra's intelligence said it would be. A pressurized vault beneath the granite maw's foundation, its walls lined with cryogenic storage racks that held the DMAC dynasty's original bioweapon stockpile. The archive terminal was still active, its countdown clock showing 43 minutes until incineration. Lyra jacked her diplomatic credentials into the console, her fingers flying across the interface as she downloaded the pathogen sequences, the authorization logs, the dated council signatures, every piece of evidence that proved the DMAC hardliners had planned the war years in advance. The data package was enormous. The transmission window was not. The DMAC enforcers breached the subchamber's outer door just as the download reached 91%. Marcus moved to intercept them, placing his body between the console and the incoming fire. The first plasma bolt caught him in the shoulder, burning through his shirt and searing the synthetic polymers woven into his musculature. His rewired nerves cataloged the damage and dismissed it. He grabbed a fallen cryogenic rack, a solid titanium frame weighing maybe 400 kilograms, and hurled it at the breach point. The rack slammed into the lead enforcer, folding the armored DMAC backward into his squad with a crunch that echoed through the vault. The download completed. Lyra initiated the broadcast on a frequency piggybacked onto the DMAC's own military relay network, a trick she had learned from a Conquered intelligence briefing about asymmetric comms warfare. The evidence package screamed across the sector, hitting every neutral monitoring station, every Conquered embassy, every civilian news node. The bioweapons program, the council signatures, the falsified treaty negotiations, it all went public, simultaneous and undeniable. High Chancellor Drevek received the alert on his command cruiser 80 seconds later. The invasion fleet was already 7 minutes from conquered space. His tactical officers watched the diplomatic fallout spread across their screens like a contagion. Neutral systems that had been wavering suddenly closed their borders to DMAC military traffic. The conquered fleet, previously scattered and leaderless, coalesced around a single galvanized command structure, Princess Lyra transmitting live from the enemy's most sacred temple, calling for a unified counteroffensive. Drevek's political coalition shattered before his ships could fire a single shot. The hardline council members, exposed by the evidence, were arrested by their own internal security forces within the hour. The invasion collapsed. Marcus didn't know any of this yet. He was still in the subchamber, holding the breach point, his body now a roadmap of plasma burns and shrapnel lacerations. The DMEC enforcers, seeing their chain of command disintegrate, surrendered their weapons. Lyra walked past them, her hollow bones carrying her with the bearing of a head of state who had just ended a war from beneath a murder trap. She looked at Marcus, at his ruined hands and the placid calm in his eyes, and she finally understood what she was seeing. Not a cultural attaché. Not a failed experiment. A weapon that Earth had discarded and the galaxy had dismissed, until he had lifted a 500-ton stone and exposed a conspiracy that spanned 8 centuries. The final surprise came 3 days later, when Conquered Intelligence decrypted a secondary file embedded in the DMEC archive. It wasn't a pathogen sequence. It was a research dossier on Project Atlas, compiled from the dissections of the 11 subjects the DMEC had captured and killed over the preceding decade. The file contained a conclusion that chilled every analyst who read it. Marcus Cole was not the 12th subject because he had survived. He was the original, the augmentation template from which all the others had been imperfectly cloned. The DMEC had been hunting him not to replicate his strength, but to destroy the source code before anyone else figured out what Earth had actually created. Marcus took the news sitting in a medical bay, his hands wrapped in clean bandages for the first time in years. He listened, nodded once, and then asked the conquered medical officer if there was any coffee on the ship. The galaxy's predators had just become prey. And the quiet, unassuming man who had started it all was already thinking about his next salvage run. The granite maw had stood for 8 centuries as a monument to the galaxy's certainty that some things were impossible. That certainty shattered when a human who didn't look like a weapon proved that organic strength had limits no one had ever actually tested. The DMEC dynasty's invasion collapsed, its council in chains, its bioweapons exposed. The conquered survived because a princess refused to stop transmitting and a bodyguard refused to stop pulling. But the deeper revelation, the one that military analysts on 50 worlds are still grappling with, is that Marcus Cole wasn't an anomaly. He was a template. Earth had created the source code for a new kind of soldier, then buried the project out of fear. The DMEC had spent a decade killing every copy they could find, never realizing the original was still walking around, bleeding from his nail beds and asking for coffee. That changes the math. Humanity isn't the soft intellectual species the galaxy dismissed. It's a species that engineered strengths it decided were too dangerous to use, and then quietly sent those strengths out into the void wearing diplomatic credentials. The question that lingers isn't whether Marcus Cole can lift a 500-ton stone. It's how many others like him are already out there, waiting for the moment the galaxy makes the same mistake twice. If this story of impossible strength and quiet courage kept you watching, please like this video and share it with someone who loves a good underdog tale. Subscribe and ring the bell for more stories about the moments humanity reminded the universe exactly who we are. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.